When the world tilted, before the chaos, before the bombings, before the uniforms swallowed entire populations, life felt ordinary. There were quiet mornings, familiar streets, and the predictable rhythm of everyday work. But in the late 1930s, an uneasiness drifted across continents. Governments clashed, borders shifted, radios buzzed with anxious voices, newspapers printed warnings that citizens tried to ignore. Women felt the world tilt first. They felt it during conversations at markets. They felt it when husbands and sons spoke in low tones at the dinner table. They felt it when leaders on the radio assured everyone that peace would hold. Their instincts said otherwise. Then the war erupted. Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. Japan continued its expansion in Asia. The Soviet Union mobilized. The United States watched from a distance before being pulled into the conflict. Entire continents trembled. Women felt the immediate shift. Prices changed. Crowds panicked. Children sensed fear. Soldiers marched through streets with unreadable expressions. Armies grew so large that neighborhoods emptied of young men almost overnight. Women stepped forward to absorb the shock, recognizing that society would collapse unless they found a way to stabilize it. They had no choice. They adapted faster than anyone. Mornings that no longer felt like mornings. War mornings felt heavy, as if the air itself carried tension. Women woke before sunrise, not because they wanted to, but because every task required more time and more planning. Sleep was patched together between sirens and distant explosions. Some nights brought none at all. Women began each day with ration books laid across kitchen tables. They counted stamps, calculated meals, and reworked menus until numbers finally aligned. Breakfast was not a meal to enjoy, it was a carefully measured strategy. A single egg was precious. A slice of bacon was a luxury. Bread was stretched with fillers to last longer. Tea was reused. Coffee became weak brews made from roasted barley or chicory. Children asked why the food tasted different. Mothers answered with gentle lies to protect their innocence. They learned to smile through hunger. They learned to make nothing feel like something. Air raids warped these mornings. Sirens pierced the sky without warning. Women rushed children into shelters, clutching blankets and gas masks. They waited underground while bombs thundered above. Sometimes the shaking was mild. Other times entire buildings collapsed. Afterward they returned to kitchens dusted with debris and simply continued cooking. Life had no pause button. Even women in countries far from battlefields felt the strain. In the United States, rationing forced families to cook creatively. In Canada, shortages of sugar and meat transformed recipes. In Australia, shipping routes disrupted supplies. Mourning had become a time to adapt, adjust, and continue with relentless discipline. Women did not complain. They carried the weight silently. The rise of the female workforce. With men deployed, the workforce faced a massive void. Factories that once depended on thousands of male laborers risked shutting down. Nations realized that production lines were as crucial as battlefields. Weapons, vehicles, and supplies needed to be made faster than ever. There was no solution unless women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to touch. And they did. Women flooded factories in the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and the Soviet Union. They wore scarves tied tight over their hair. They rolled up sleeves and put on heavy gloves. They walked into environments they had been kept away from their entire lives, forging steel, welding aircraft frames, operating cranes, building tanks, packing ammunition, sewing parachutes, testing engines, inspecting rifles, assembling radios. These were no longer male jobs, they became women's daily lives. Inside factories, the air smelled of hot metal, oil, and sweat. Machines roared so loudly that thoughts felt muffled. Sparks flew in bright showers. The floors shook from the impact of heavy presses. Women moved with precision and speed, mastering tools with confidence that surprised even themselves. Their bodies changed, arms grew stronger, palms hardened, shoulders ached, but their spirits grew with pride. Many worked 12-hour shifts, then returned home to care for children. They did not rest, they did not stop. They became the mechanical heartbeat of the war effort. In the United States, figures like Rosie the Riveter symbolized this shift, but real women deserved the recognition. In Britain, factories stayed lit through the night as women worked under blackout conditions. In Canada and Australia, aircraft factories operated non-stop, and women were the reason production did not collapse. In the Soviet Union, women labored under brutal cold, assembling tanks while bombs fell on nearby towns. The world had never seen female labor on this scale. It changed everything. Women of the land. Not all work happened in metal factories or machine-filled warehouses. Food production became an urgent matter. Many countries risked starvation. Men who once worked on farms were gone. Fields were empty. Tools were unused. Animals still needed care. Crops could not wait. Women stepped into agricultural work with fierce determination. In Britain, the Women's Land Army trained recruits to plough fields, milk cows, manage livestock, harvest crops, and repair equipment. Many were former shop clerks, secretaries, students, or housewives. They arrived in the countryside with soft hands and left with calluses. They lived in hostels far from home, rose before dawn, and worked until the sky darkened. Their labor fed soldiers and civilians. Their effort prevented famine. In the United States, rural women maintained farms with the help of children and elderly relatives. They planted corn and wheat, cared for animals, tended gardens, drove tractors, and delivered produce to local markets. Women repaired fences and fixed engines with improvised tools. They did the physical work of full farm crews. In the Soviet Union, conditions were far harsher. Women farmed through winters that froze the soil and endured battles that destroyed entire villages. They harvested grain under artillery fire. They kept farms alive even after losing husbands, sons, and brothers to the front lines. In Asia, women worked rice fields and vegetable farms under occupation, facing shortages, violence, and forced labor. Their small harvests fed entire families despite impossible conditions. Agriculture during the war was painful, exhausting, and necessary. Women kept their nations fed, one field at a time. The reality of rationing. Rationing shaped every decision women made. It taught them patience, strategy, and sacrifice. Food was controlled tightly. Sugar was almost non-existent. Meat portions were symbolic. Butter and oil disappeared quickly. Milk was limited to children or pregnant women. Fruits and vegetables became seasonal luxuries. Women stood in long lines outside stores, carrying ration books like sacred documents. Sometimes shelves emptied before their turn arrived. Sometimes poor weather delayed shipments. Some women cried quietly as shopkeepers apologized with sympathetic eyes. Inside homes, rationing demanded creativity. Women made cakes without sugar, pancakes without eggs, and soups with tiny scraps stretched across weeks. Cookbooks published wartime recipes with substitutions that sounded strange but tasted decent. Women traded ideas in community groups to survive shortages together. Food was not the only rationed commodity. Clothing was strictly limited. Women learned to sew and repair every garment. When a dress could no longer be fixed, it was taken apart and repurposed. Curtains, tablecloths, and blankets transformed into clothing. Shoes wore down quickly. Many women stuffed cardboard inside worn soles to delay buying new pairs. Children often outgrew their shoes before replacements became available. Soap, candles, fuel, and household supplies became precious. Women reused everything: jars, cloth scraps, twine, old tins. They learned to stretch each object to its final possible use. They balanced dignity and survival with remarkable grace. The emotional weight of ambiguity. Every day carried uncertainty. Women lived with the fear of losing someone they loved. Letters from soldiers were gifts sent through chaos. Women held onto them with reverence. They read them repeatedly. They memorized handwriting. They stored them in boxes lined with fabric or tucked them under pillows. Some days brought no letters at all. Weeks passed. Months passed. Women tried to stay hopeful, but fear ate at them. They waited by windows for mail carriers. They froze when footsteps approached. The most dreaded moment was receiving the military telegram. Women saw the messenger's uniform from down the street and prayed he would walk past their door. If he stopped, the world seemed to collapse. Women fainted. Women screamed. Women fell silent. Every reaction was human. Every loss reshaped a family forever. Even when news was good, anxiety persisted. Injury notifications meant long recovery. Missing in action meant painful uncertainty. Captured by enemy forces meant brutal nightmares of what might be happening miles away. Women carried grief privately. They rarely talked about their pain because they still had to make meals, care for children, and continue working. Their emotional labor was invisible but immense. Nightlife in wartime cities. When the sun went down, wartime cities changed dramatically. Blackout curtains covered windows, streetlights dimmed, entire towns went dark. Women learned to navigate streets with only faint moonlight guiding them. Air raid sirens sounded without warning. Women grabbed important papers, blankets, and emergency kits before rushing to shelters with their children. Underground bunkers filled with families. Some prayed, some cried, some whispered stories to keep children calm. Bombs fell unpredictably. Explosions shook foundations. Dust rained from ceilings. Women held their families tightly, whispering reassurance they barely believed themselves. After raids ended, women emerged to find glassized streets, collapsed buildings, fires, and wounded neighbors. They helped each other dig through rubble. They searched for trapped victims with bare hands. They offered first aid to strangers. Cities never slept peacefully. Even silence felt dangerous. Women in military service. Women across the world stepped into military service with courage that shifted global history. British women joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service and served as radar operators, mechanics, drivers, intelligence assistants, and anti-aircraft unit aides. They tracked enemy planes with precision that saved cities from destruction. American women joined the Women's Army Corps, the Women Air Force Service pilots, Navy Reserves, and Marine Corps Reserves. They decoded messages, flew transport aircraft, repaired machinery, forecast weather, and handled logistics that kept troops alive. Soviet women served on the front lines. They became snipers, pilots, machine gunners, and medics. The Night Witches flew night raids in flimsy aircraft with unbelievable bravery. Snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko became legendary marksmen. French women in the resistance transporting messages, sabotaged train lines, supplied hidden fighters, and rescued Allied troops. Their work was risky and vital. German women joined military support units later in the war. They managed communication networks, manned anti-aircraft guns, and supported overwhelmed medical teams. Japanese women served as nurses and laborers under strict wartime control. Many faced hardships from bombings, shortages, and the collapse of their cities. Wherever they served, women carried roles essential to victory and survival. Nurses at the edge of chaos. Nursing during the war was one of the most intense and emotional experiences any woman could face. Field hospitals were set up in tents, abandoned buildings, or makeshift shelters. Nurses worked endlessly, surrounded by wounded soldiers whose injuries ranged from burns to amputations to infection-ridden wounds. They mended bodies while carrying emotional burdens. They held the hands of dying soldiers who begged to send messages home. They risked their lives when hospitals came under attack. They operated in blood-soaked conditions without proper equipment. Many nurses collapsed from exhaustion. Many suffered trauma long after the war ended. Their sacrifices were as real as any soldiers, women under occupation. Millions of women lived beneath the rule of enemy forces and faced horrors that reshaped generations. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Eastern Europe, women navigated curfews, shortages, and violence. They hid children, helped Jews escape, and sabotaged occupiers in small but powerful ways. In Poland, women faced unimaginable brutality. They protected families while living through constant danger. Many joined underground movements despite the risk of execution. In China, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other parts of Asia, women endured forced labor, starvation, violence, and oppression from occupying Japanese forces. Entire communities lived in fear. Yet even under the darkest circumstances, women found ways to resist, survive, and protect each other. Daily life in occupied cities. Life under occupation did not resemble normal existence. It was survival shaped by fear, caution, and constant unpredictability. Women in occupied Europe and Asia woke each day unsure what new rules had been imposed or what new danger waited outside their doors. Soldiers patrolled streets, loudspeakers announced curfews, flags of foreign armies hung above city halls that once belonged to peaceful communities. Food was scarce, markets sat half empty. Women walked miles to stand in lines that stretched around corners, hoping to find bread, potatoes, or milk. They often left with nothing. Many scavenged for edible weeds or bartered family possessions for a handful of flour. Children cried from hunger. Older relatives grew frail in silence. Women also lived with the constant risk of retaliation. If a sabotage operation occurred nearby, occupying forces sometimes punished innocent civilians. Women learned to move carefully, speak quietly, and hide their emotions. Even a suspicious glance could bring unwanted attention from soldiers. Despite the danger, women found ways to support each other. They shared food with neighbors whose children were starving. They passed messages to resistance fighters. They hid radios under floorboards. They forged documents. They risked everything because hope survived even when everything else crumbled. War tested their courage every single day. Acts of defiance and quiet resistance. Not every act of resistance looked dramatic. Some were subtle, secretive, and quiet, yet they held enormous power. Women smuggled bread to prisoners in hidden corners of cities. They whispered news from banned radio broadcasts. They carried messages in their shoes or hidden inside baskets of laundry. They memorized coded information and delivered it without leaving a trace. These actions kept underground networks alive. Some women listened to forbidden foreign radio stations and spread news to neighbors. Others painted resistance symbols on walls late at night. Many created safe houses for Jewish families, Allied pilots, or escaped captives. They bathed children who had not seen clean water in weeks. They gave away clothing and medicine they needed themselves. Every action came with risk. If caught, punishment was severe, yet women refused to let fear silence them. In France, Belgium, Norway, Greece, Poland, and Yugoslavia, women fought a hidden war. They moved like ghosts, leaving no evidence behind. They were never taught to be spies, yet they became experts because survival required creativity. Their quiet resistance proved that bravery does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it lives inside the heart of a woman who refuses to surrender her humanity. Mothers who carried the weight of fear. Motherhood during wartime demanded superhuman strength. Women carried their children into shelters during bombings, covered their ears to block explosions, and whispered stories to keep them from crying. They turned fear into comfort even while their own hearts pounded with terror. Mothers taught children how to put on gas masks and explained blackout curtains in simple terms. They guided them through rationing. They answered questions about fathers who were far away, sometimes with hope, sometimes with uncertainty. Mothers shielded children from horrors they could not fully process. They kept routines as normal as possible. Breakfast still mattered, bedtime still mattered, birthdays still mattered even if the cake was small and candles were impossible to find. Many mothers raised children alone after receiving a telegram that changed their lives forever. Some never remarried because the wound ran too deep. Others remarried only after the war, choosing partners who understood their loss. Some children were evacuated to the countryside. Mothers placed them on trains and waved goodbye, trying to smile as the doors closed. They waited months or years to see them again. Letters from host families were lifelines. Motherhood was a battle fought without recognition, medals, or public ceremony. It was a battle of love, fear, sacrifice, and resilience. Women in concentration camps. Among the darkest chapters of the war were the concentration camps spread across Europe. Millions of men, women, and children were imprisoned, tortured, and killed. The daily life of women inside these camps stands as one of the most tragic and powerful testimonies of human endurance. Women in camps faced hunger beyond imagination. They were given watery soup, moldy bread, or nothing at all. Their bodies weakened quickly. Illness spread easily. Many mothers tried to hide extra food for their children even while starving themselves. Women comforted each other in shared bunks. They whispered encouragement in crowded barracks. They held hands when someone grew too weak to stand. They protected younger prisoners from guards. They supported elderly women who could not walk. They shared memories of homes they might never see again. Some women formed secret circles of resistance inside camps. They smuggled scraps of paper. They kept lists of names to preserve memory. They risked their lives to sabotage work assignments. Even inside the darkest places on Earth, women held onto identity, dignity, and the belief that survival carried meaning. Many did not live to see liberation. Those who survived emerged with trauma that lasted a lifetime. Yet their courage remains one of the strongest symbols of humanity against cruelty. Women in Asian and Pacific regions. The war in Asia and the Pacific reshaped daily life for millions of women from China, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and numerous Pacific islands. Japanese expansion brought military occupation, violence, and forced labor. In China, women worked to rebuild cities destroyed by bombings. They carried water from distant wells, gathered firewood, tended crops, and raised children while entire communities fought for survival. Many fled from advancing armies, traveling long distances on foot with whatever belongings they could hold. In the Philippines, women hid in forests and mountains to escape conflict. They created hidden villages and cooked meals over small fires to avoid detection. Many assisted guerrilla fighters by gathering intelligence or providing shelter. They lived with fear of raids that could strike anytime. In Korea and other occupied territories, many women were forced into labor or taken from their homes. Entire communities lived with trauma that reached across generations. On Pacific islands such as Guam, Saipan, and New Guinea, women survived on limited food and constant fear as battles raged across their homes. They shielded children, navigated bomb-filled landscapes, and rebuilt villages shattered by combat. Despite the hardships, women across Asia created networks of mutual support. They shared food, cared for the injured, passed warnings of approaching forces, and helped each other survive. Their courage in the face of brutality remains one of the most powerful truths of the war. Women in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Eastern Front of the war was one of the most violent in human history. Women in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe endured suffering beyond imagination. Yet they also displayed heroism unmatched in scale. Soviet women worked in factories that produced tanks, ammunition, and aircraft while cities burned. They labored in freezing conditions with limited food and no heat. Some lived in factories full-time because traveling home was too dangerous. Millions of women were evacuated from threatened cities to distant regions. They traveled in overcrowded trains on foot or in carts pulled by horses. They carried children, elderly relatives, and limited belongings through chaos. Women fought for their country alongside men. The Soviet military enlisted hundreds of thousands of women as snipers, machine gunners, medics, and pilots. The Night Witches became legendary for their silent bombing missions in lightweight planes. Soviet female snipers defended cities with unmatched precision. In Poland, Ukraine, and other Eastern European regions, women faced invasion, occupation, and violence. Many joined resistance movements. Others hid in forests or fled east for safety. Countless women sacrificed everything to protect their families. The brutality they endured shaped the course of the conflict and the character of an entire generation. Women in North Africa and the Middle East. In regions like Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Palestine, the war brought new responsibilities and new dangers. Women in North Africa experienced shortages, military presence, and shifting control over territories. Some women worked in medical units treating soldiers from all sides who fought in desert campaigns. Others cooked for troops, repaired clothing, or assisted families fleeing combat zones. Jewish women across the Middle East participated in underground movements aimed at creating safe routes for refugees fleeing Europe. Palestinian, Lebanese, Egyptian, and Iranian women managed homes, while men were drafted into armies or joined resistance groups. Even in areas where combat did not reach, women felt the war through economic hardship, rationing, and political unrest. Their resilience strengthened communities that were not fully understood by the outside world. Women in the Americas. In the United States, the war transformed society. Women filled factories, shipyards, offices, farms, and laboratories. They joined the military. They served as pilots and mechanics. They took on roles that were unimaginable before the war. In Canada, women contributed to military manufacturing, agriculture, and volunteer organizations. They knitted clothing for troops, prepared care packages, and managed entire households while men served overseas. In Mexico, Brazil, and other Latin American nations, women supported supply chains, joined medical units, and maintained economies. Some communities contributed labor and resources to allied efforts. Women became the anchors of families and cities undergoing major cultural shifts. Across the Americas, women grew more independent. They learned new trades, earned wages, and gained confidence. These experiences helped shape social change long after the war ended. The psychological battle. Even when women appeared strong on the outside, many fought silent emotional battles. Anxiety was constant. Fear lived inside every thought. Women felt guilt when food ran out, even though it was beyond their control. They felt fear when letters stopped coming. They felt isolation when friends or neighbors disappeared without explanation. Many women developed habits to cope with emotional strain. Some wrote journals filled with thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. Others attended community gatherings to feel less alone. Some clung to symbols of hope such as religious items, photographs, or childhood memories. Every woman created her own emotional armor. Some cracked under pressure. Others held on through unimaginable strength. Their resilience was a quiet miracle woven into the fabric of survival, rebuilding after the war. When the war finally ended, women found themselves in a world that felt familiar yet completely transformed. Cities lay in ruins, entire families were missing, nations were divided, economies collapsed. Veterans returned home changed by trauma. Women were expected to transition back into pre-war roles, but many resisted. They had tasted independence, they had proven their skill, they had survived challenges that reshaped their identities. Still, society pressured many to leave their jobs so returning soldiers could work. Some women obeyed, others refused. The tension between progress and tradition defined the post-war period. Women also participated heavily in rebuilding their nations. They cleared rubble from destroyed streets. They rebuilt homes with scarce materials. They planted crops in devastated fields. They cared for wounded veterans and orphaned children. They became the emotional foundation of recovery. Their work was often overlooked, but without them reconstruction would have failed. The long aftermath. The war did not end when the guns fell silent. Trauma remained. Many women suffered nightmares for years. Some never spoke about what they witnessed. Others shared stories only with close family. Physical scars healed slowly. Emotional scars lasted much longer. Women who served in uniform struggled to receive recognition for their contributions. Many were denied veterans' benefits or overlooked in history books. Women who worked in factories were forced back into domestic life without acknowledgement of their sacrifices. Despite this, their impact was permanent. They had changed economies, shifted cultural expectations, and proven that society could not function without them. Their strength helped shape the next generation's views of women and their capabilities, a legacy written in courage. The true story of World War II cannot be told without acknowledging the women who carried entire nations through the darkest period of modern history. Their days were filled with fear, sacrifice, exhaustion, and determination. They rarely sought praise. They simply did what needed to be done. They woke early. They labored until their bodies ached. They rationed food. They shielded children. They endured bombings. They wrote letters filled with hope. They prayed silently. They fought in battlefields, resistance cells, hospitals, farms, factories, and classrooms. They stitched the world together while it tore itself apart. Their courage shaped the world we live in today. The rights women have now, the opportunities they pursue, and the respect they continue to fight for are rooted in the efforts of those who stood strong in the face of global conflict. Their legacy is immense. Their strength is unforgettable. Their stories deserve to be honored with the same reverence given to the most celebrated figures in history. The women of World War II did not just support the war, they helped win it. They helped rebuild, they helped redefine what women could be. Their courage changed the world forever. The war inside the home. The home became a battlefield of its own. Even in places far from direct combat, women faced a steady drip of challenges that tested their patience and strength every single day. Walls may have still been standing and roofs may have still existed, but the emotional climate inside these homes was shaped by fear, sacrifice, and constant adaptation. Electricity was rationed. Women learned to cook in dim light. They scheduled oven use with precision because fuel was limited. Some days the power cut off without warning, leaving kitchens cold and silent. Women kept candles ready for these moments, but often saved them for emergencies because they burned too quickly to replace. Laundry became a grueling task. With shortages of soap and hot water, washing clothes took hours. Women scrubbed uniforms, blankets, and children's clothing by hand. They reused water when possible, wrung out fabric until their arms burned, and hung clothes indoors during winter months when frost cracked the air outside. Homes also became temporary hospitals. Children became sick from cold weather and limited diets. Women learned basic medical care, using boiled water, herbs, and whatever medicines they could obtain. They nursed elderly relatives whose health declined from hunger and stress. They checked on neighbors after air raids, offering hot broth or blankets even when they barely had enough themselves. In many countries, women also cared for evacuees or refugees. Homes that once felt crowded with one family suddenly held 3 or 4. Kitchens designed for small meals became production centers for entire groups. Privacy vanished. Bathrooms became shared spaces. Living rooms transformed into sleeping quarters. Yet despite the pressure, many women insisted on maintaining warmth in their homes. They decorated with simple touches to remind families that life still held beauty. A photograph placed carefully on a shelf, a vase holding flowers found near a bombed park, a quilt stitched from scraps. They preserved humanity in spaces threatened by despair. Education in a world at war. School life became unpredictable. Some schools closed after bombings. Others ran half days. Teachers struggled to maintain normal lessons while dealing with shortages of supplies and the constant threat of raids. Women stepped in everywhere. Many women worked as substitute teachers, ensuring children continued learning even when regular teachers were drafted or displaced. Others organized classroom spaces in church basements or community centers. Some taught children while sitting in shelters during raid alerts. Homework was often completed by candlelight. Children wrote essays using pencil stubs and recycled paper. Mothers encouraged their learning even when they were exhausted from work shifts. They checked assignments while stirring pots of thin soup or patching worn clothing. They reminded children that education mattered, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. In rural areas, children walked long distances through harsh weather because buses were scarce. Some carried small lunches made from rationed scraps. Others had no lunch at all. Teachers often shared food quietly so children would not feel ashamed. Education also served as an emotional anchor. Children learned songs, poetry, and stories that reminded them of peace. Women volunteered to organize simple plays or music performances that gave children moments of joy. These small events felt precious in a time where innocence was always at risk. The hidden war of women in intelligence. Intelligence work became one of the most crucial aspects of the conflict, and women played roles few people knew about for decades. Their work unfolded quietly in office buildings, private homes, secret headquarters, and occupied cities. Many women served as codebreakers. In places like Bletchley Park in Britain and Arlington Hall in the United States, women decoded encrypted enemy messages using complex systems that required patience, logic, and intense focus. They spent hours analyzing patterns, studying leaks in ciphers, and piecing together clues that helped Allied forces anticipate enemy movements. Their work contributed directly to major victories, yet secrecy surrounded their service. After the war, many women were forbidden from discussing what they had done, even with their families. In occupied Europe, female intelligence agents risked everything to gather information. They memorized troop movements, reported locations of supply depots, and tracked enemy officers. They disguised themselves as domestic workers, market vendors, or messengers. Their information crossed borders through hidden channels and saved countless lives. Some women operated safe houses for spies and resistance fighters. They prepared meals, forged documents, and created cover stories. Their kitchens became meeting centers. Their hallways echoed with whispered plans. Their basements hid fugitives from patrols. Women also monitored radio frequencies and collected intercepted transmissions. They worked in military intelligence offices, analyzing maps, writing reports, and building dossiers. Their contributions remained quiet but monumental. Women in scientific and technical fields. The war accelerated advancements in science and technology, and many women stepped into roles that shaped innovations still used today. In laboratories across the United States and Britain, women worked as chemists, physicists, mathematicians, and engineers. They tested materials for aircraft, analyzed chemical compounds for medicine, studied weather patterns for military planning, and built early computer systems. Women calculated ballistics for artillery units using advanced mathematics. They plotted flight paths and helped design equipment that improved soldier survival. Their research supported everything from radar systems to medical treatments. In the Soviet Union, women scientists worked in freezing research stations, testing soil for crop production, and studying the effects of cold climates on machinery. Their findings helped the military survive brutal winters. Women also assisted in medical research. They developed treatments for infection, blood loss, and disease. They managed hospital laboratories and produced vaccines that protected soldiers from illness. These scientific contributions proved essential to victory. Women advanced fields that had once rejected them entirely. Friendship and connection in the middle of chaos. Despite the stress and fear surrounding them, women built strong communities that kept their spirits alive. Friendship became a lifeline. Women supported each other emotionally, physically, and spiritually. They formed sewing circles that doubled as support groups. They shared ration recipes and taught each other new methods to stretch ingredients. They exchanged clothing for children, fixed old garments, and swapped tools. Women gathered in community shelters during raids, holding hands and praying together. They comforted crying children and whispered encouragement to strangers. They offered shoulders to cry on when neighbors received devastating news. Some evenings, women hosted small gatherings with whatever food they could find. They played music on old radios, danced in cramped rooms, and laughed in ways that reminded them of life before the war. These moments of joy helped them stay strong through the darkest nights. Even in countries far from the front lines, women bonded over shared responsibilities. In the United States, women joined volunteer organizations, knitted socks for soldiers, organized scrap drives, and trained in emergency response programs. These activities created bonds that lasted for decades. Friendship became a powerful force that sustained entire communities. Relationships and romance in wartime. Love unfolded differently during the war. Distance tested relationships in ways couples never imagined. Letters carried affection across oceans. Couples clung to small keepsakes like handkerchiefs, photographs, or lockets. Women wrote letters filled with hope, news from home, and reminders of love that persisted through danger. Some romances blossomed quickly because the future felt unclear. Soldiers married sweethearts during short leaves. Women married men they barely knew because time was limited and life was unpredictable. These relationships were built on intense emotion, urgency, and belief in something bigger than fear. Many women lived with the anxiety of not knowing whether their partners were safe. They reread letters for comfort and waited for the next message. Mail delays caused panic. When letters stopped, women imagined the worst. After the war, some couples reunited joyfully. Others struggled to reconnect after long separations or trauma, but during the war itself, romance offered women moments of hope and purpose. Women who were single also navigated shifting social norms. The war allowed them to meet new people, explore independence, and build futures that would have been blocked before. Some found confidence in their new roles. Others built friendships that later transformed into love. Even in chaos, the human heart searched for connection. Women in post-war justice movements. As the war neared its end, women played important roles in helping uncover war crimes, rebuild legal systems, and support displaced persons. Women assisted in documenting testimonies from survivors of occupation, forced labor, and concentration camps. They gathered evidence later used in trials. They cared for children liberated from camps and searched for their families. They staffed relief camps and helped distribute food to starving populations. Some women joined early human rights organizations that later influenced global policy. They advocated for justice, accountability, and recognition of suffering. Their work shaped the moral framework that emerged after the war. In countries recovering from destruction, women volunteered to help clean schools, reopen hospitals, and rebuild neighborhoods. Their work created the foundation for post-war recovery, the shift in gender roles. Before the war, many societies held rigid ideas about what women could and could not do. War shattered these rules. When women entered factories, farms, laboratories, and military offices, they proved their competence beyond doubt. After the war, governments encouraged women to return to domestic life. Many propaganda campaigns urged women to give their jobs back to returning soldiers, but women had changed too much to simply surrender their independence. Some returned willingly to family life, others remained in the workforce. Many fought quietly for rights they had earned through service. Their contributions sparked debates that shaped future generations. In countries across the world, the post-war period marked the beginning of new conversations about equality, opportunity, and gender norms. Women who worked during the war raised daughters who expected more from society. Their influence lasted long after the war ended, unsung heroes whose names history forgot. Countless women contributed to the war effort in ways that were never recorded. The seamstress who repaired uniforms until her fingers bled. The mother who shared her ration of bread with a starving neighbor. The nurse who saved dozens of lives in a makeshift hospital. The farmer who harvested crops during freezing winters. The factory worker who assembled engines without recognition. The teacher who kept children learning inside bomb shelters. The teenager who delivered messages through occupied streets. The grandmother who kept families grounded through wisdom and patience. The refugee who survived unimaginable suffering yet continued caring for others. History often focuses on leaders, generals, and battles. But the war was held together by ordinary women who did extraordinary things. Their bravery lives in stories passed through families, in letters kept safe in drawers, and in memories that outlived the conflict. The spiritual strength of women. Spirituality played a large role in how women coped with the war. Some prayed daily for the safety of loved ones. Others found peace in community gatherings where hymns were sung softly in candlelit rooms. Some lit small candles near windows as symbols of hope. Others carried religious tokens for comfort. Even women who did not follow specific religious practices found strength in personal beliefs, traditions, or cultural rituals. They created emotional anchors that kept them centered when the world felt chaotic. These spiritual practices created resilience that spread to children, neighbors, and entire communities. Women who returned home forever changed. When the war ended, women carried emotional scars that society often ignored. Some suffered from anxiety or sleepless nights. Others had flashbacks when hearing loud noises. Many cried in private for years. Women who served in uniform returned home proud yet conflicted. They felt the weight of experiences they could not fully share. Some found they no longer fit into the domestic roles expected of them. Others struggled with the loss of comrades or with survivor's guilt. Women who worked in factories and farms faced confusion about their futures. They had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. They had earned wages and learned skills. Returning to traditional roles felt restrictive. Yet despite these challenges, women rebuilt their lives. They raised families, pursued careers, continued volunteering, and helped shape modern society. Their inner strength became the foundation of post-war generations, a final reflection on their legacy. The women of World War II carried burdens that reshaped history. Their days were filled with hardship, yet also with unbreakable determination. They stood in the center of a world at war and refused to collapse. Their daily lives were not just footnotes in history. They were epic stories of sacrifice, creativity, courage, and humanity. They were the quiet force that kept nations standing when everything seemed destined to fall. Their legacy lives in every modern woman who works, learns, leads, and dreams. Their resilience continues to inspire generations who never met them but benefit from the world they helped rebuild.